Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. Today with me, Jarrod McGrath, founder and CEO of Smartable FM. He is an author, thought leader, public speaker. It's an honor to have him as a guest. Join us in this amazing conversation. Welcome, Jarrod. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great, Andre. Thank you for reaching out and thank you for asking me to take part in the show.
Not a problem. I have to say, Jared, that someone with your experience and especially someone from, I would say, the other side of the world for me, it's always good to have different perspectives. And before we go into anything in your experience in your career, I would love to give a brief overview on your journey and who you are. I read your website and I know that you have what a journey to actually becoming who you are today. So do you mind give us just a quick overview on your steps into becoming who you are today?
No, I'd love to. So I grew up in Australia in a small country town that had a population that was predominantly servicing the farming industry. And my father was a mechanic and my mother worked in the motor dealers there. But I always had a love for people and I've always had a love for business. And a lot of my friends were tradespeople. They were electricians, they were plumbers, and they were sheet metal workers, and they did very practical things. And so I grew up always with a very practical background. And I then went on to study mathematics and computing and artificial intelligence and statistics. And this was a long time ago, and it was before all of these topics today were so prominent and so relevant. And I moved to Sydney, to one of the largest cities in Australia, and have been there ever since. And I've had a number of businesses over that time. But for the last 20 years in particular, I have spent that time in the workforce management space. And it's a space that I really love and I really enjoy.
I have a question because you mentioned something like it's interesting that you started in a very practical environment, and I'm quite sure that helped making decisions over time because you had that sense of like getting things done. One of the things you mentioned in one of your public appearances is about being a pioneer, and one of the things I was going to ask is like, where did that spark from that entrepreneurship started?
I think it's actually just a desire to embrace change and try new things. And I think anyone can be an entrepreneur as long as they've got the right mindset and they want to try something and ultimately not be afraid of failure. Because I've tried a lot of things over the years and not everything has worked. So I think you've just got to be ready for change and embrace it and roll with it. And so I think a lot of people can do it. Not everyone is probably up for it.
Mhm. And requires, I would say, a huge part of bravery because you need to take that risk to start in the end of the day. Jared, from a small town, you wrote, I'm going to start here. You wrote two books, one about the digital workforce and the other one about the modern CEO. I would say both are very people centric, and I hear you a lot speaking about being a true advocate for people. And I wanted to ask about where did that passion for that people centric, not only leadership, but I think people centric first, where did that start and how important it is in your world? So, in the world of Jarrod McGrath, how important it is?
It probably stems right back to my parents, Andre, and they were always helping people. They were always giving back. They were always involved in the local community. And so I had a, a network around me that was very people centric. And I think a lot of it then comes back to a lot of my mates that I grew up with being very practical in terms of the work that they did. And I would often go along, and one of my friends, he was an electrician, and I would often go along and help him. And you'd be working at people's places, and you might be pulling a cable through someone's roof. And it was amazing how engaging and how wonderful the engagement with that customer was when you just sat down and chatted to them and had perhaps a cup of tea with them. And when you're actually just showing your vulnerability and showing your human side, you actually get so much more sincerity and realness out of the conversations that you had or have. So I think it's just naturally being wired in me all my life to know that if and that same friend that I just referenced, he always said behavior breeds behavior. And I think if you're good to people, they'll be good back to you. And and roll forward to today where you're in this environment that's so technology centric, so AI centric. Your only differentiator is a person and what that person brings in terms of their emotions, their conversation, their experiences.
One of the things you said in one of the videos I saw was, um, let's imagine if people were not treated like a number and really work to empower people. That resonated with me because you just said something very similar. Um, how much is the change that especially leadership have to take to embrace that mindset change? How big is the jump in your
You
opinion?
It depends on the organization and it depends on the leader that's responsible for that organization and the culture that is embodied within that organization, because some organizations are wired like that and the change for them is not so hard, but other organizations aren't wired that way and the change can become really complicated. But I think if you're going to empower people and you're really going to trust people, you have to let your own confidence in your people run, and you have to support them. And if you can do that and people can be themselves, you get an amazing result. Because if people try to be something or someone that they're not, they're working in an adopted style or an adapted style, and you're never going to get the best out of
Mhm.
that person. But if you can let someone work in a way that they can be themselves and they can be natural, you'll get the best from that person because they will be able to be themselves. They won't be trying to put on some face or some act that they're not. And ultimately, you'll then start to get to their core, which is ultimately their passions.
Mhm.
And so it's a whole mindset and it's a whole philosophy on how you lead people.
And to step on that, so one of the latest books you wrote is about the modern CEO. What do you think that is the role, or what should be the role on the CEOs to cultivate and help the business navigate that challenge?
So the first thing I'll say is that you have to be commercial. So I'll sort of step away from the people for a moment, because as a CEO, you have to look after the risk associated around the organization. You have to make sure the finances are right. You have to deliver on the outcomes of what the shareholders and so on are expecting. So the first thing is that I will lead with the CEOs have to have a commercial mindset without a question of a doubt. So then it's about balancing how do you meld or work that commercial mindset with then getting the most from your people. And and that becomes the challenging piece, because we're sort of sitting there, on one hand we want to make money, but then on the other hand we want to give people the best flexibility or the most flexibility and choice that we can in the way in which we operate. So again, it's about giving our other leaders in the organization, the managers in the organization, and the people the guidelines and the framework to be able to understand what our business outcomes are, understand what we're trying to achieve, understanding what the commercial constraints are and the risks that are associated on our business, but then allowing those people to be themselves. And that's the real challenge. And not every organization is ready for that. And different organizations are at different levels of maturity. But if you don't think systemically and you don't take a big picture approach on how you lead, and you don't understand what all of these intercepting points or crossover points are within your organization, you're going to struggle to achieve the commercial outcomes that you're looking for, and also getting the best out of people. And these days, people have greater expectations on the organization that they did in the past. So it's a very much more a collaborative environment now. So there's a lot more for CEOs and senior leadership teams to line up to actually get the most out of people and the commercial outcomes.
One of the analogies, if you allow me, that I remember one of the previous guests mentioned about this, and I think as you were speaking, that popped to my mind, is about gardening. When you and seasons, and you started, like you said, being from a small town, you cannot harvest everything at the same time. You need the gardening process as seasons, and to extract the best from the land you have, you need to work with it. It's very similar to maximizing people in the different environments. I think it's a very good analogy for in that sense. And I really liked what you mentioned about that the role being so wide. There is only specific strings you can pull, and it really is important to understand the levers that you can pull at every single point in time. Let me go to your company. So you are CEO of Smartable FM, and one of the things I believe you guys do on as a consulting company is really focus on helping companies to kind of developing their digital muscle. I think this is something you mentioned word by word, the cross organizations. What are the strategies that different companies can have to foster that digital adaptation and learn and continuous learning of the digital technologies? Is there anything you could share that help people to get practical on their strategies?
I can share some thoughts around it and some practical experiences around it. And I think if you look at kids or you look at people at university today, they're naturally wired digitally. They will use digital tools to get an outcome, to get a result, to learn something, to use ChatGPT or whatever it is to solve a problem that is at hand for them. And that's what digital muscle at the end of the day is all about. It's actually having an understanding of the technology that's around you. It's having an understanding of the people that are around you, and it's understanding the environment in which that people and technology coexist. And it's about being able to work out the best way to leverage all of those pieces working together, and ultimately to be able to adapt and to change quickly. It needs to become intuitive to you. And it's not about these days going to protracted learning courses about a piece of technology or about a human skill. It's about being able to continually learn and have these knowledge areas consumed in a way that it becomes part of your intuitive decision-making process. And I think ChatGPT is a wonderful example of that, because people with the digital muscle will adapt to that very quickly. They know how to write the code to go into an engine to actually generate an outcome that they're looking for. But as well as that, they're also intuitive to apply the human skills to the result to ensure that the result actually makes sense in the context of why they've asked that algorithm for that information in the first place. So digital muscle is about being able to adapt and adopt the situations that are thrown at you every day. and be comfortable with them. So if you come from a background that is just process centric or it's just technology centric, and you're not wired to take in these other variables or influences, you will probably struggle to become intuitive around the digital muscle that we need to be successful today.
Jared, one thing that you mentioned about technology, and this is, I think it's a very common, I hope it's common knowledge, is you mentioned ChatGPT and other technologies. I see loads of efforts from big tech companies to automate and to make sure like that autopilot in almost everything. I spoke with different leaders in the industry that actually advocate for the technology enabling humans to be best at what they can be best instead of just purely automate. It's more about being co-pilots. Like, how do we get that technology enabling and enhancing and empowering people? And I think it's still very polarized. The way I see the industry is very polarized. It's there is no clear path. We have, I think, both forces trying to figure out like what's the best thing to do. And I think big technology companies that are in the space are probably looking at both, but with that aim for that autopilot automation. I wanted to have your thoughts, like being in this space for such a long time, you probably saw multiple transformations over the last few years. What is your thought on the role that that autopilot and the risks that it can have versus trying to create that co-pilot, which is enabling people to be at their best in every single time?
Yeah, I think in days gone by, you had people, process, and technology, and they all coexisted. I think today the process piece needs to be raised up, and today I believe you have people, technology, and the environment in which they sit, of which process is a part of the environment. And the way in which all of these areas interact, it's not one direction. They're all bi-directional and they all talk to each other. And so what we need to be able to do is to balance the outcome that we're trying to achieve with all of those influences in mind. And what I really think we need to do to get it right is that we need to get our leaders to give us direction around how they want us to balance people, technology, and environment together. So if I give you a practical example, at an enterprise level, are we trying to get the most from our people? Are we trying to maximize the value we get from our people? Are we trying to minimize cost? Are we trying to minimize risk? Are we very strong on governance? Are we very strong on compliance as an organization? And I think it's the role of the leaders and the shareholders and the stakeholders within these organizations to give very, very clear boundaries around the influences at the enterprise level so that the people in the organizations can balance the best way to put together the people of the technology in that environment. So it's about basically understanding the guardrails and the guides that exist. And it's knowing that none of this is just moving in one direction, because you can get the value or the guide rail from the stakeholders, from the leaders, but then in a practical sense, you might be working with the technology and it might be offering you suggestions on, did you know that this person that works in your team consistently has a flexible workday on the first Monday of every month? So do you want to proactively go and speak to them about making that perhaps more permanent? So it's getting the guardrails right, and then it's actually letting the technology influence and empower the people, and then the people giving back their inputs to this technology so that it's learning. So it's a complicated environment, but at the end of the day, you've got in the center, you've got your people, your technology, and the environment it sits, and then around the edge, you have the stakeholder influences that sit there, and you just have to balance those.
And One of the things you speak a lot about is hierarchies, I'm trying to coach you on this one about the traditional hierarchy and the fact that we operate in a very linear way. If I'm not mistaken, that's quote. I think I'm quoting you right. What is your view about that new operating model and what benefits organizations can have from it?
I think if I'm being critical, the hierarchical model is very command and control. So, it's the stereotype view of someone sitting in the corner office and yelling out a command and, you will do this and I don't really care what you do because I'm telling you to do it. And I know that's an extreme example, but a lot of organizations come from that background and they operate in that way, and that's okay if you're not working in an empathetic way towards people and towards what drives them, because today people want to be heard and they want to have a voice, and at an organizational level, you need to listen to the people and you need to listen to the voice and you need to be empathetic to their needs, because we live in a world today that 100 years ago, when these operating models were built, we sat there, and at that time we were sort of mechanizing, in the third industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution. So we built these hierarchical models based off what we had available to us in those times. We had no technology. We had no understanding of the psychological needs of people like we do today. And the reality is a hierarchical operating model is not fit for the organization and the maturity of the market that we exist in today. We need to work in a much flatter way. We need to form teams. We need to understand what our organization is trying to achieve. Again, we must be commercial. Let's not forget about that, because it's, without the commercial mindset, we're not going to be successful and our organization's not going to exist. But we need to understand what drives our people and what drives us to the ultimate outcome. And we need, if we can get the best out of everyone and start letting them be themselves, naturally we get more productive environments. Naturally we get better output. Naturally we get better accountability and ownership of what we're trying to achieve. So to me, this is not something that's negotiable anymore, because the hierarchical operating model was built off what we knew 100 years ago. And I was doing some research when I wrote The Modern CEO, and I found a hierarchical model, or the hierarchy that existed at the Ford Motor Company. I think it was in 1912. And the way that hierarchy existed does not cut it today. It is we work in a different place, and if we're still thinking about hierarchies, we're not setting ourselves up for the future.
Mm-hmm. I really like that you just said. To go a bit deeper on that, is a clear role that diversity, inclusion, and belonging, they play a vital part of the organization, because like when you think about taking the best from people, you need to find that balance, not only on organizations, but I think in society in general. How can leaders find that in space and balance that and encourage people to be open, as well as making sure that the discussions around the different topics are seen from multiple perspectives? How do you see that driving change, and how do you see like leaders taking advantage of that diversity that exists today?
So I think the first thing is just having a mindset to know that we live and work in a diverse society. And diversity manifests itself in many different ways. It can be religion, it can be country, it can be a raft of different things. It can be diversity just in thinking about a certain topic. So it's a very broad term. And so that's the first thing, to understand that diversity is something that's broad. But I think if I was to suggest a framework to think about diversity, I'd say there's probably 5 parts to it. There's the person, there's a family, there's a community, there's society, and then there's the planet. And within that, we have different people that think about these things and fit into this framework in many different ways. And as a leader, if you can think about diversity in a broad way and think what's driving this from maybe the person's family perspective, what are they trying to achieve, what's their cultural background, what are the things that our people are thinking, that helps us actually build an organization that accepts and embraces diversity. And diversity is not about hiding behind the differences. Diversity is about just acknowledging that there are differences there and talking about them and embracing them. And again, we may not, as an organization or as a CEO, be able to cater for the specific diverse situation that exists, but it's about talking about it and saying back to the person or the group of people why or why not we can consider that particular piece of diversity. So it's not about being driven or overpowered by a certain way of thinking or a certain cultural background or anything like that. It's just being able to have an open mind and being very comfortable to chat about diversity, and then working out how that fits into the needs of your organization, and back again to those enterprise influences that I was talking about earlier on. So I think diversity comes down to the right mindset, and then from a skill set perspective, it's actually having the confidence to talk about it and work through it with our people.
I was going to say just that. I think it's about openness and that courage to be okay and to empower people. One of the things that I wanted to ask still in this regard is, let's go specifically to workforce management, and we see across different organizations a much more diverse landscape on the workforce. And I still think that we are very traditional. So workforce management can be very niche, and I think we are still very traditional in multiple companies around, not only about the hierarchy, but about process and about other challenges that are seen in the industry. What is your view about workforce management as an industry for the future? Like, what do you see changing in the next years that everyone that is listening that works in this field should be prepared for?
So the first thing, and it's probably just it's just a philosophical comment, I guess, on workforce management. Most people that are in this space have fallen into this space via some sort of circumstance, because you don't go to university and study workforce management per se. It's not like accounting or law or finance or whatever it happens to be, medicine. They're very structured. They're very well developed industries that have matured over a lot of time. Workforce management's this funny little niche that sits between operations and finance and HR and marketing and IR and ER or whatever, legal. And it's this little niche that pulls all of these different areas together. And to get workforce management right, all of these different areas of the organization need to work together. So I'm going to go back to basics. I'm going to answer the question in two halves. The first part is to go back to basics with workforce management and actually understand how all of these different pieces fit together, because you're never going to get the best from a workforce management initiative unless you can get all of these different pieces working together. And it comes back to that systemic thinking that I was talking about earlier, and those enterprise influences that I was also talking about. So you first got to go back to basics, but there's no real course to study this. So a lot of it's on the job. So again, we need to develop learning institutes, and we need to develop programs to help educate not only the people in the workforce management industry about what it is, but those that are outside it to what it is. So So that's sort of a little bit more of an inward view of the world. But I think more broadly, where workforce management's going to go, there's no doubt that AI is going to play a greater part in it, and it's going to utilize the data that comes back, like the example I gave earlier about, the technology suggesting that someone might want to have Mondays off because they've got certain needs, or optimizing the way in which we put together a roster so that it can maximize, let's say, cash flow into a register, but yet minimize the cost of labor. But I think from a people's perspective and an employee's perspective, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more fintech coming into the workforce management space, because there's some really exceptional fintech technology out there now. And if you think about where we're going more broadly across the people space, which workforce management is an integral part of, we're really starting to look at people and their experiences. And so what people want now is they want to be able to essentially start working today. They want to be able to know what they're getting paid today. They want the pay in their bank account at the end of the shift. As employers, we want to be able to offer the right benefits to our team. So that could be insurance policies for life. There could be some flexibility around maybe the way in which we get paid, perhaps by some gift cards, or we might want to give part of our pay to other people that are in our family, for example, or we might want to do something that's philanthropic. And so fintech is enabling a lot of really wonderful people experiences. And so while it's not specifically workforce management in the traditional sense of workforce management, it's all about people and people experiences. And I see a lot of opportunity in that space coming up over the next few years. And I think those that embrace that are going to be able to offer wonderful flexibility and choice and experiences to the people that work at those organisations. Notwithstanding all of the AI and everything else that will, optimize what we traditionally know in workforce management around productivity and so on.
No, but I love that fresh angle that you just mentioned. It's a first to me, and I really liked it. Jarrod, just to take it a bit more personal, so I would love to ask these questions about, like, what would the younger version of yourself, the boy that was just starting in a small town, growing up, what would that boy ask you today if you were seeking advice?
I'd probably ask me if I've always been the best version of myself that I can be, but I probably know the answer to that. But sometimes I sit back and I think, Jarrod, you've written these books and you've done all of these different things and you've tried all of these different businesses. Have you really just been too diverse in all of the different things that you've done in your life? I'd probably question that, but I'd never change the answer to it, I don't think, because I've had a ball, having a very diverse background. And I think it's really helped me as a leader be very people-centric and advocate that value of people that we spoke about, right at the top of this conversation, Andre.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jarrod, my last question, we go back to the WFM industry. You mentioned a bit about what the future. I really liked your perspective, but let's say a perfect world where you had no limitations, budget, time, resources, that you could fix anything for the industry. What thing would you aim for?
I think it was the same. It'd be the same answer pretty much as what I said earlier on. I think I'd go back to basics and I'd make sure that there's a common language, a common understanding around workforce management. And I'd be looking to drive a little bit more consistency into the way in which we go about the different disciplines around workforce management, which at its core are around compliance, around productivity, around efficiency, and around people's experience. And I think if we can get more knowledge and more consistency in the way we think about this, we can drive greater outcomes. So I'd be taking a bit of a back to basics approach. I'd like to see a lot more workforce management introduced into university curriculums. And all of this takes some pretty significant investment and a lot of people to be wanting to head down this path. But I genuinely believe the more education and the more knowledge that we can give to people, the better off we'll be. And so I'd again take a bit of a back to basics approach, I think, in terms of where I would be heading with, the investments that I'd be making. And that's where I'd be going, Andre.
I love that we end back on investing in human capital. That's in the end of the day, that's what it is. And I really love that learning and the definition of a standard for the industry. I couldn't, if you asked me to sign off, I would sign off on that blindly. Jarrod, thank you so much. It was truly amazing to have you as a guest. Any final words to our listeners?
No, just have a bit of fun when you're doing things, and don't get too critical at the end of the day. Like, life is short, and you just got to make the most of what you've got. And always, I think if you can go to bed every night and believe that you are the best person or version of yourself that you can be, and you are genuinely there looking out for people, I think you'll sleep pretty well at night.
Thank you so much. And to everyone, I hope you guys continue to be the best version of yourselves. Jarrod McGrath, thank you so much for joining us today.
That's great. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Andre.